12 kilometers up, in the sky, where the temperature drops to minus 50 degrees. Where the air outside is so thin that if you broke that window, you'd lose consciousness in just 15 seconds. Every single day, more than 300,000 people travel through this exact condition. And just a few inches from their heads, sits a thin, fragile sheet of plastic keeping them alive. Think about it, the pressure outside is so low that if your body were exposed to it without protection, your blood would literally begin to boil. It's called the Armstrong limit, the altitude beyond which the human body simply cannot survive unaided. And despite all of this, every single day, without a second thought, we buckle our seatbelts, sip our coffee, watch a movie, trusting our lives to nothing more than a thin sheet. But now, look a little closer. Right at the bottom corner of that window, there's a tiny hole. A hole that millions of people have seen, but almost no one has ever stopped to ask why it's there. Is it a defect? A manufacturing mistake? Or, was it put there on purpose? Most people assume it's just for air circulation. A small design choice. But the real story is far more shocking than that. Let's start with what most people assume. Maybe this hole is for fresh air. Maybe it's there to give passengers a better breathing experience. That sounds completely logical. After all, the plane already has an entire air system, vents, circulation, filters. So why not a small air hole in the window too? But when engineers and aviation experts actually explain this, the answer turns out to be something completely different. This hole isn't for fresh air. It isn't for passenger comfort either. The truth was something else entirely, and this story begins in a place where some of aviation history's most painful events are buried. Because this tiny hole was born out of a massive tragedy, imagine this. It's the 1950s. The aviation industry is stepping into its golden age. Jet engines are brand new. Planes are flying faster, bigger, and higher than ever before. A new aircraft enters the world, the de Havilland Comet. The world's first commercial jet airliner. Think about how magical this must have felt to people at the time. A machine that could fly twice as fast as propeller planes. One that could carry passengers across continents in just a few hours. Newspapers call it the future of travel. Airlines invest heavily in it. Passengers buy tickets with excitement. The Comet was so revolutionary that it was the first commercial aircraft to cruise at such high altitude, to avoid turbulence and give passengers a smooth, luxurious experience. But flying at that altitude meant pressurizing the cabin much more. And pressurizing it more meant far more stress on the fuselage. At the time, not a single engineer fully understood just how much more that really meant. But behind this shining story, something deeply dangerous was hiding. And when it finally surfaced, it shook the entire aviation industry to its core. Picture this for a moment, a Comet aircraft, flying through a clear blue sky. Passengers relaxed. Some asleep, some reading magazines. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound. And then, everything stops. The plane literally breaks apart, mid-air. This wasn't a single accident. In 1954, within just a few months, 2 Comet aircraft were destroyed this exact same way. In both cases, the plane disintegrated in mid-air, without warning. Investigators were baffled. Was it pilot error? Weather? A bomb? No answer satisfied anyone. But the strangest part was still to come. Engineers gathered the wreckage, literally pulling pieces out of the ocean, trying to understand what had gone wrong. They thought it might be engine failure. They thought it might be a structural weakness they'd already known about. But when they reconstructed the plane's fuselage, the tube-shaped body of the aircraft, they found something completely unexpected. Cracks. Tiny cracks. And where were they starting from? The corners of the windows. At the time, the Comet's windows were square-shaped, with sharp corners. Aesthetically pleasing. Modern-looking. But those sharp corners had given birth to an invisible enemy. An enemy whose name was metal fatigue. Picture bending something back and forth, again and again. Take a paperclip. Bend it slightly, straighten it, bend it again. The first time, nothing happens. The second time, still nothing. But slowly, invisible cracks begin forming inside the metal. And one day, without any warning, that paperclip simply snaps. This is exactly what was happening to the Comet. With every flight, as the plane climbed and the cabin pressurized, like a balloon inflating. Then, as the plane landed, that pressure released, like the balloon deflating. Inflate. Deflate. Inflate. Deflate. Over and over. Flight after flight. And with every single cycle, stress built up at the sharp corners of the windows, until, one day, the metal finally crossed its breaking point. And the moment it did, the pressure inside the plane escaped so violently that the entire fuselage tore apart within seconds. The passengers never even knew what happened, but before investigators could even land on this theory, another tragedy had already struck. South Africa's BOAC Flight 201, another comet, broke apart in mid-air in almost the exact same way. The third time. Within a single year. This was no longer just a technical mystery. It had become a national crisis. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Is jet travel even safe? Is the comet cursed?" Public confidence had completely collapsed. People began canceling their tickets in droves. The British government made an unprecedented decision: they grounded the entire Comet fleet. Every single aircraft. Worldwide. This became the largest aviation investigation the world had seen up to that point. And the outcome of this investigation wasn't just going to decide the future of one company. It was going to decide whether the entire concept of jet travel would survive. This isn't just a story about technical failure. Inside every one of those planes, there were real people. Families heading off on holiday. Business travelers. Children. The engineers working on this investigation were under immense pressure. On one side, the entire world was demanding answers. On the other, every day of delay meant more lives at risk. The team leader and his team did something that had never been attempted before. They took an entire Comet fuselage and submerged it in a massive water tank. Then they created artificial pressure cycles, simulating the plane taking off and landing, over and over, except all of it happening inside a lab. Imagine their weight. After every single cycle, they'd check, is the fuselage still intact? At cycle number 1830. The fuselage tore apart. In the exact same way the real planes had crashed. Now, finally, they had proof. But getting to that proof wasn't as simple as it sounds. During testing, the first time a crack appeared, the team stopped everything. They thought maybe it was a fluke. They rechecked the material. Everything looked normal. So they restarted the cycles. And in the exact same spot, the crack began growing again. In that moment, the room fell silent. Because everyone in it knew, this was no longer just a lab test. This was the answer that so many grieving families had been desperately waiting for. This discovery was massive. But it was only pointing toward one small change that would transform the entire aviation industry forever. Engineers realized, sharp corners concentrate stress. Just like a tightly knotted rope snaps faster than a loose one, sharply angled windows weaken metal far more quickly. The solution? Rounded corners. Oval-shaped windows. Today, when you sit inside any commercial aircraft, every single window corner is rounded. This isn't a style choice. It's a lesson that was learned, at the cost of human lives. But the story doesn't end here. Because the real question, the one about that tiny hole, still hadn't been answered. Even after the window shape was fixed, engineers faced an entirely new challenge. Modern aircraft windows aren't actually made of a single layer of glass. Imagine this: every window has 2 or 3 separate panes, stacked one behind the other. The outermost pane, the one you see from outside, bears the full cabin pressure. It's the strongest layer. The middle pane, the one you actually touch from your seat, is a backup. If the outer pane were ever to fail, which is extremely rare, this middle pane can take over and handle the cabin pressure. The innermost layer is just a scratch-resistant plastic sheet, giving you that cool, smooth surface to touch. But here's where a new mystery begins. If the middle pane is just a backup, how is it supposed to handle that much pressure if it's always sitting off-duty? The answer is going to shock you. Picture a small gap between the two glass panes, like the filling inside a sandwich. If that gap were completely sealed, what would happen? As the plane climbs and the outside pressure drops, the pressure inside the cabin is artificially maintained, to keep passengers comfortable. But if air gets trapped behind that middle pane, with nowhere to go, that trapped air will build its own pressure. The pressure difference, between the outside air, the cabin air, and this trapped air, can become large enough to place massive stress directly on that middle pane. And if this keeps happening, flight after flight, that same old enemy comes right back. Metal fatigue. Or in this case, material fatigue. The exact same thing that destroyed the comet. Engineers realized, if they did nothing, history was about to repeat itself, and this is exactly where that tiny hole, the one we saw at the very start, comes in. This hole, which engineers call a breather hole or bleed hole, is placed right at the bottom corner of the middle pane. Its job is simple, but genius. This hole connects the trapped air behind the middle pane directly to the cabin's pressure. Meaning, no pressure difference can ever build up. As the plane climbs, air passes easily through this tiny hole. As the plane descends, the exact same thing happens in reverse. The result? No extra stress ever builds up on the middle pane. Only the outer, strongest pane handles the actual pressure, exactly as it was designed to. Such a tiny hole, carrying such a massive responsibility. This hole can literally save your life. But this hole has one more secret, one that very few people know about. This hole doesn't just balance pressure. It fights off another dangerous enemy too, one that quietly attacks on every single flight. Condensation. Imagine, when the outside temperature is minus 50 degrees Celsius, and the cabin inside is a comfortable 20-something degrees, moisture begins building up between those two panes. If that moisture isn't controlled, the window fogs up. It turns cloudy. Sometimes, ice can even form on the inside. This hole equalizes the trapped moisture with the cabin's dry air, dramatically reducing the risk of condensation. So this one tiny hole is actually performing two critical jobs, balancing pressure, and controlling moisture. But from here, the story gets even more dangerous. Because what happens if this hole gets blocked? Even today, passengers sometimes notice a window corner looking foggy, or slightly cloudy, mid-flight. Most people assume it's just a cosmetic issue. But for engineers, it's a warning sign. If the bleed hole gets blocked for any reason, dust, a manufacturing defect, or damage, the middle pane starts to feel the pressure of that trapped air behind it. This isn't immediately dangerous, because the outer pane is still the primary structural support. But if ignored, over time, that same old story that destroyed the comet could repeat itself. This is exactly why airlines regularly inspect their windows. If a window stays persistently fogged, it gets replaced, no risks taken. Such a tiny hole, carrying such enormous responsibility. 1988 near Hawaii, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was cruising over the Pacific Ocean. Passengers were relaxed. Flight attendants were serving drinks. Suddenly, a massive bang. And then, something happened that no one could have imagined. An entire section of the fuselage, part of the cabin roof, literally tore off. As if someone had ripped open a tin can, passengers sat there, held only by their seatbelts, staring straight up at the open sky, at 24,000 feet. One flight attendant was pulled out during the decompression. This incident, just like the comet crashes, came down to the exact same cause, metal fatigue. But this time, it was a combination of corrosion and repeated pressurization cycles, because this aircraft was already 19 years old and had been used for short island hopping flights, meaning it had been pressurized and depressurized far more often than normal. The pilot, Captain Robert Skornsteimer, somehow managed to land the plane safely. It's considered nothing short of a miracle. This incident reminds the world, aviation safety is never truly solved. It's a continuous fight. Every small detail, whether it's the corner of a window, or the skin of a fuselage, must always be monitored. This is exactly why that tiny bleed hole matters so much. It isn't just a design feature. It's a silent soldier in that ongoing fight. Now, think about the scale of this for a second. Every commercial aircraft has, on average, 30 to 40 windows. Right now, at this exact moment, around 9,000 commercial flights are in the air across the world. That means, at this exact second, millions of tiny holes, ones that never cross your mind for even a single moment, are silently doing their job, balancing pressure, preventing condensation, saving millions of lives. And all of this, without any power source, without any electronic sensor, without any complex mechanism at all. Based purely on the simplest principle in physics, equalization. This hole is a perfect, silent example of that exact principle. Think of it this way, when you open a bottle of soda and hear that soft hiss, that's pressure equalizing, the high pressure inside meeting the lower pressure outside. Something almost identical is happening inside an aircraft window, except so slowly and so controlled that you never hear a sound, never feel a thing. That difference, the gap between control and chaos, is the real power of engineering. Designing something so precisely that natural forces do the work themselves, without ever causing a disaster. Now picture the process behind making a single window. It's far less simple than it looks. Each pane is made from stretched acrylic, a material far stronger than ordinary glass, and one that can handle extreme temperature swings. During manufacturing, every window goes through multiple stages. First, it's precisely molded, then put through controlled heating and cooling cycles, to reduce internal stress within the material. Then comes the most dramatic part of the process, testing. Engineers apply massive pressure to the window, far beyond normal flight pressure, to see how much extra load it can withstand. In many cases, this pressure is 2 to 3 times higher than normal operating pressure. In some labs, windows are even put through bird strike simulations, where high-speed projectiles are fired at them, to replicate real-world impact scenarios. Only once a window survives all of these tests is it considered fit to be installed on a real aircraft. And through this entire process, that tiny bleed hole, which seems so insignificant, goes through testing just as rigorous as the entire window itself. Because engineers know, when lives are on the line, no detail is ever small. When we talk about aviation history, we remember the pilots. We remember the famous flights. We celebrate the record-breaking journeys. But who remembers the engineers who, after the Comet disaster, stayed up night after night designing this tiny hole? These people never saw their names in history books. No one celebrated them at an award show. But every single time you sit in a plane and look out at the clouds, without ever knowing how much engineering is hiding right there, you're enjoying the fruits of their work. This is their silent legacy. Small things we never even notice, that are quietly keeping us alive. Think about the test pilots who flew new designs for the very first time, knowing that if there was even one mistake in the calculations, they would be the first person to pay the price for it. Think about the quality inspectors who hand-check every single window before it ever leaves the factory, because one tiny manufacturing defect, at thousands of feet in the air, can become catastrophic. These people don't do this work to make a name for themselves. They do it because they know, on every single flight, someone's son, someone's mother, someone's best friend is sitting in that seat. Next time you're on a flight, try a small experiment. Ask your flight attendant, what's this tiny hole for? Chances are, they won't know the exact answer either. They might say, it's for air circulation, which is a common misconception that's spread even among aviation staff themselves. Isn't that a strange fact? Millions of people, all around the world, sit right next to this tiny hole every single day, and yet remain completely unaware of its real story. It shows that the best examples of engineering are the ones that work so seamlessly, we forget they even exist. Perfect design is design that becomes invisible. Today, aviation regulations are so strict that every single window design is rigorously tested, pressure cycles, extreme temperatures, impact resistance, all of it. The Comet disaster taught the entire industry that aviation safety isn't just about engines or wings. It's about every single small detail. A sharp corner. A pocket of trapped air. A tiny hole. These things, which look insignificant on the surface, can actually be the difference between life and death. This is exactly why people in the aviation industry say, every rule is written in blood. Every regulation, every design choice, is a lesson learned from some tragedy. And that tiny hole sitting in the corner of your window, it isn't just a hole. It's a reminder. Next time you're sitting on a flight, looking out the window at the clouds, take a moment to look at that tiny hole. That hole, so small that most people never even notice it, is silently, every single second, working to keep you alive. We conquered the sky. We taught humans to fly 12 kilometers up, at 900 kilometers per hour. But the things we see every single day, the ones we pass by without a second thought, often carry engineering far more complex than we could ever imagine. Sometimes, the greatest safety, is hidden in the smallest of things. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here, not just for aviation, but for life itself. We often look at big, shining achievements, rockets that reach space, buildings that touch the sky, machines that move faster than we could ever imagine. But behind them, there are thousands of tiny, unseen decisions. The right angle. The right material. A tiny hole, placed exactly where it needs to be. These things never make headlines. There's no grand unveiling for them. No one steps on stage to take credit for them. But these are the exact things that make everything else possible. So next time you're about to dismiss something as small or insignificant, whether at work, in your relationships, or in any part of your life, pause for a moment and think. Because as we saw today, the world's greatest tragedies, and its greatest safety, both, hide inside one small, forgotten detail. Next time the seatbelt sign turns off, and you look out at the clouds, remember, that calm, that sense of freedom you feel, was only made possible because someone, once, asked a question about a tiny hole.